From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
We've lost. We've lost on almost every count. We've lost almost every single national level power institution that the right used to own or was at least neutral. And the balance of power is overwhelmingly on the left side. What's in our power is to reform the right so that it is focused on that kind of problem.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Arthur Milikh, Executive Director of the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life and editor of the new book, Up From Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay. We'll talk in depth with Arthur about that book a little bit later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Matt Mehan. He is Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Government for the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C., also the author of multiple children's books, Mr. Mehan's Mildly Amusing Mythical Mammals, and more recently, The Handsome Little Cygnet. Dr. Mehan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Talking about children's literature today, because there is a lot of talk about children's literature today, or at least books for children, and that's where I want to start. Talk about books for children, but not necessarily about children's literature. So how would you contrast those two terms or descriptions?
Yeah, books for children just definitely sounds like medicine, right? Like we're going to force feed you a certain message or an ideology or answer some question that you need answered in the moment. So it's very present-minded, books for kids, books for children. Children's literature, to my mind, I mean, when you say literature, you mean sort of the best of that which has been written, bonnes lettres, that kind of thing, like the good letters that Cicero talked about. And that's more of like the old classical ed trivium grammar. People think grammar was just like how to parse a sentence and whether it's in this case or that, or it's a subject or predicate. The grammarian and the good grammar program is about the best stories, things that are beautifully said and that put the truth of things beautifully. And I think that's what children's literature is. And books for kids are sort of like, the good version is something like, how a bill becomes a law, right? Yeah. Which is just sort of like an explanation for children at their level. And then I think, have infinite numbers of bad versions just wander the bookstores today.
There can be, as you allude to, this baseness or crassness or ugliness in children's literature sometimes. How can the good stuff rise above all of that?
Well, I mean, children's literature, when it's illustrated, that's the easiest way to answer the question. The illustrated children's literature, it has to be beautiful in form, both the word images, the word pictures that are painted in their mind, and the images themselves, the illustrations. And that requires a real attention to the rules of nature, right? If a body is supposed to be shaped this way, but you sort of do a Picasso thing with an eye floating, 2 feet in the air and snaggle teeth sort of scattering and separating. And by the way, I'm actually referencing a Nickelodeon-inspired book, children's book, or book for kids, I should say, book for children. Then you've actually represented the universe, the natural world, the created world. You've represented it as something ill-made, something ugly, because we actually do respond to beauty and ugliness no matter what. So you might say cool because it's different, but you still are also underneath. You might say cool as a kid, but you're also like, and kind of shocking and ugly.
Yeah.
But if that's how you present the world to children again and again and again and again, not just like an ugly bad guy, right, or an ugly exception, but this is the rule, you've basically lied to them about the nature of things and made them less well-equipped to live a happy life.
Your books are beautiful, both Mr. Mehan's Mildly Amusing Mythical Mammals and The Handsome Little Cygnet. Take us through the process a little bit of marrying your narrative, what you want to say in a book like that, to the visual and the beauty of those books.
Our books are unusual in one sense that Oftentimes what you do is you write the book and then you submit it to a publisher, and the publisher just finds an illustrator who does their own thing. John Foley and I are good friends, and we worked together for many years, not just on these books, but even prior, teaching together literature and art. And what we do is we actually have a very kind of hands-on process where I communicate all kinds of symbology, and then he gives feedback, and we go back and forth with drafts to try to get the images to really sync up. T.S. Eliot has a phrase, the objective correlative, that is to say the object must correlate to the sense of the thing. If in this case the words are the sense, well, the object, the illustration, it must correlate, right? So if you really want something, what the ancients called a cosmos, meaning a beautifully well-ordered whole, if you actually want that, an image of the truth of things and how they all relate and make sense in an ordered universe, and by the way, the universe is ordered, then you have to do that, I think. So I'm actually sometimes, no offense to wonderful, lovely authors, I'm sometimes appalled when they're like, I loved what the illustrator did. I'm like, you didn't control that? I'm just shocked because I'm like, I think to do that right, there has to be a unity between those two things. And that unity, I think, is when people go, wow, this is beautiful.
I was talking recently with one of our Hillsdale K-12 literature teachers and talking about young readers. And we're saying, for the summer, make sure their bookshelf is stocked and they have choices to read. And we got into a discussion because my wife doesn't like this, but I will leave books around the house so that my kids can encounter them and hopefully be interested. But that allows them to see the book and the cover, not just the spine, the title. Thinking about your covers, how important is that strikingness or the ability to attract the young reader with don't judge a book by its cover, but judge a book by its cover.
Yeah, right. Don't do that, except do that, and everyone does do that. Yep, right. We spent a lot of time. It's actually kind of fun in just having described how we have this very collaborative effort. The first book, I was this is the image, that the freedom of the two lead characters floating off into a blue sky. We actually framed the font and the image off of the old Parisian balloonists when they were first inventing hot air balloons, and this sort of like sense of lift and freedom and wind and lightness, which is what, the theme of that book is sadness, the blue in the field, like kind of lofted and countered by a certain bright sunlit whiteness, and the yellow balloon versus the sort of blue ears of the dally dragging down, and poetry sort of helping the heart to not give in to sadness, which little did I know COVID was coming, and that theme wound up being very important. But I was more worried about social media and loneliness for kids and things. But so I really wanted that. And I think that one came off very well. And the second one, I had an idea, like, this is what I want. I want this panorama, et cetera. And John, my illustrator, is like, I think this intimate shot of the mother and the little baby, Signet, kind of curled together with these bright whites. I think that's going to work. And he had to muscle me hard. His wife came in, like my wife, everyone's like, no, we're changing this. And I'm like, okay. And it wasn't being exactly correct.
An author intervention.
Yeah. Thank goodness for friendship and counsel. Right. But so we do have a lot of discussion about what's the striking image that's at the core. And we thought that the second book's image of the intimacy between the mother and child and the care and protection of a child, which is the first stages of childhood. And that's one of the themes, right? Is be careful, where you wander and how far you stray from the traditions of your family who love you most.
Dr. Matt Mehan is with us, children's author, also associate dean and assistant professor of government for the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C. Back to more of the children's literature genre at large. This is somewhat of a tricky question, but I wanted to hear your perspective, which is there are a lot of books for children today that essentially say, oh, this is a book that will explain X to children, this current event, this thing that's happening. This is a book that will help explain Y to children. They have to read this so that they have this knowledge as they grow up. Is it okay? Is it permissible for children's literature to somewhat exist outside of the current cultural obsessions?
In one sense, it has to be good. And in another sense, no. You're always talking to a present audience when you're launching a book, right? And getting it to be first sort of engaged, right? And something's classic because a lot of people at a certain point when it was released said, this is worthy.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be dumb to like just leave yourself bereft of that advantage of talking to the moment. But there's a way in which you talk to the moment. And that is, I think, you look at the problems and the struggles and the concerns of a particular moment, and then you turn and think, what in the sort of universal palette of truths should I then render in image that answers those questions, problems, errors, pressing concerns? And so then that lets you basically take the book out into a kind of timeless milieu that can last the test of time, because it's speaking about the kinds of truths that don't change over time, even though there's contextual hints and ironic nods to things that are in the present moment. And we've tried to do that with both of the books we've written.
So what can great, timeless children's literature accomplish for both kids and for their families?
So the Horatian sort of edict that good literature must both delight and instruct, I think, is always the first place to go. And we've already kind of covered beauty. I think that's a kind of duty of the artist in word and in image, right? In painting and the visual arts. I do think that both of our books, in one way or another, although the second one was harder to say when I sold it because it seemed more inappropriate, but it was still the case. But I shopped the book around. I did a national tour for the first one. I was like, this isn't a kid's book. This is a family book, right? In fact, I think we talked about it on the radio when it first launched. The idea of being able to speak to multiple audiences. And to my mind, that's one advantage. It brings the whole family together, right? There's things that are going on, ironically, that the adults are seeing and older kids, and then the younger kids are seeing a more literal and first blush read of the story. Mm-hmm. But the advantage to doing a family book like that and having multiple audiences that can engage on multiple levels is they have a shared text together that they all love and kind of enjoy in their different ways. And you can grow up with the book, right? Which, selfishly, that means maybe it'll keep selling for many years after you fell in love with it when you were a kid. But you can read the book once, twice, thrice, and then as an older person, you're like, oh, that's happening too. I mean, I think that's the mark. I remember reading The Odyssey in 9th grade in high school going like, okay, like giants and violence and travel. And then again in college, you're like, wow, this is really deep. And then again, as a grown man with a family and the struggles of normal adult life. And it hit me in a completely different way. You're like, wow. So that's what I try to do. And I think that's what good kids books even do. Good kids literature.
This idea of having a book that the family can enjoy together and that perhaps you could enjoy as an 8-year-old and a 15-year-old and a 30-year-old down the line. We lament sometimes these days this loss of common culture, the idea that many of us are watching the same movie or watch the same TV show. We have a fractured media environment, but that's got to be true for the book world too. What are the consequences if we're not reading the same books? We don't have the same sort of understanding of great literature, especially for children.
Yeah, I mean, a unified culture. I mean, one of the things that the history of poetry is thought to have done is, right, this is the great claim. Again, go back to Homer. He united the Hellenic people. He made them a people. Shared language, shared images. Dante gets credit for unifying the Italians. Shakespeare, I think, is the national poet of the United States. That's why the Folger Library is right there next to the Supreme Court, right? And what did Tocqueville say? There isn't a forester's shack without the King James Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare throughout the American frontier. So having that kind of common literature unites a people. And so in one sense, that's, I think, a job of the poet, which is another reason why your first question in the interview about like contemporary, very present-minded issue books is actually, in a certain sense, hilariously anti-political, anti-social, anti-present moment, in that it's saying, I'm going to show you this thing now, kid. And so that means divisive. That doesn't mean unity. That means issue driven. You're basically like door knocking with a clipboard to like sign a petition, right? It's politicizing the children and dividing them. And so books are going to be no, not for my kid. Okay, for my kid. Basically, you're by doing children's books that way, you're quite literally setting up polarization or whatever, but on a deeper level than just party politics.
You're a serious guy. You're an associate dean, and you've written these semi-serious.
Maybe
you've written these books for these wonderful children's books. I wonder how serious-minded adults who want to help our children, write for children, how can they best interact with them in a meaningful way? Because we are in different planes, even though we want to sort of discuss the same themes or have the same lessons.
Well, I mean, in one sense, they should develop their own taste and then actively fashion the taste of children, right? Talk about the best movies, talk about the best books, show them the best movies and the best books, like actually surround them with beauty, take them to the art museum and skip the bad stuff and go to the good stuff, right? Like actually actively develop taste, because it's not just taste. You're actually sort of developing their receptivity to beauty, which is the primary sensible conduit of truth. So you're actually forming them by forming them in beauty properly. I mean, this is a softball serve to me. Buy my books and give them to children everywhere. But more seriously, I think also it's a labor in the modern era to actually engage Shakespeare. And I know people are like, nonsense, I love it. Like, yeah, you maybe, but the lady doth protest too much, methinks. A lot of people struggle with true high beauty in literature. And the struggle is the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. Getting a handle on it. And I think that is a way to lead people to a better understanding of beauty and culture and truth, is take the energy to say, you know what, the next Netflix show or what have you can wait. And I am going to engage Lear. My wife and I are going to read Lear together, and it's awkward and it's even cheesy. And if someone took a picture of it, they could make fun of us on social media, but sort of push past the cheese and do that. The rewards are intense and the fruits are lasting, and they trickle down into the next generation in a profound way that I think people underestimate.
So what are the benefits? What does it mean when we engage children at a young age, get them interested, excited about reading and about literature? Where do we see those benefits down the road?
I would go with Chaucer's first benefit, a good mother wit, right? Meaning you're actually more prudent. Mm-hmm. You see the warp and woof of things. That's not the right tone. And that tone reveals an error in judgment. Something's wrong here. You kind of, when you see sensible people, they carry themselves in a sensible way. They have a kind of horse sense about like something's off there, and they might not have it articulated at first, but then they eventually figure out why that's not going to work for me. I'm not investing in that company. Mm-hmm. I'm not trusting that person. I don't want him dating my daughter, like whatever it is. Right. So that I think is one of the fundamental, just very practical benefits of literature. It actually helps to shape your good common sense. And in a democratic republic, that's literally the bread and butter, right? Yeah. The people have to have common sense. So that's one. There are many others, some more elevated, some less, but that's a kind of middle but central benefit.
Dr. Matthew Mehan, Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Government for the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale in D.C., also the author of Mr. Mehan's Mildly Amusing Mythical Mammals and The Handsome Little Cygnet.
Well done.
Dr. Mehan, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you, Scott.
Up next, Arthur Milikh joins us. We'll talk about a new book he's edited, Up from Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Available now, renowned psychologist Jordan Peterson joins Hillsdale College president Larry Arnn on the latest episode of The Larry Arnn Show.
Predict the future for me a little bit. It seems to me things are coming to a point. Do you think so?
Yeah, well, I think things have always been coming to a point, but they're coming to a point way faster. well, we have Moore's law, right? Computing power doubles every 18 months. It's like, no, you don't understand. Computing power doubles every 18 months. We're now at the point in the course of technological progress where those doublings are happening multiple times within the span of a single life. And that means the ancient archetypal battles are accelerating.
Listen to this exclusive interview with Jordan Peterson right now. Only available on The Larry Arnn Show. Find it on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. And subscribe to receive new episodes delivered right to your device. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Follow us on Twitter, get up-to-date information on the show and our guests. We're at Twitter, at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined now by Arthur Milikh. He is the Executive Director of the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life and also the editor of the new book, Up From Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay. Arthur, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You say this book is seeking to reframe the ideological and policy direction of the right. Why does it need this sort of reframing that's discussed throughout the book?
Well, it's a wonderful question because, in a way, the answer is so simple to say. The answer is because we've lost. We've lost on almost every count. We've lost almost every single national level power institution that the right used to own or was at least neutral. And the balance of power is overwhelmingly on the left side. It's not normal that, of the 3,000 or so colleges and universities in America, only a tiny handful, including the beacon of them, Hillsdale, is on the right. It's not normal that just lately, the military has basically openly sided with the left. So too has what we can now call our intel state. So has the vast majority of the press. We cannot go on like this with this kind of enormous disbalance of power. And what's in our power is to reform the right so that it is focused on that kind of problem rather than merely focusing on every election as some kind of silver bullet that will solve these deeper, harder to pinpoint, harder to solve national level problems.
I want to talk a bit about what you write in the introduction and an essay you co-write inside Up From Conservatism, but first give people an idea of who else is writing in the book, this collection of essays in Up From Conservatism.
Yes, well, my view is that these are some of the leading lights of the new right, by which I mean people that want to rethink the direction that the right ought to take to tackle that institutional disbalance of powers in the country. Many of them are my colleagues at the Claremont Institute. Many of them are also professors at Hillsdale College, one of our longtime friends, as maybe you know and some of your listeners know. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale, used to be the president of the Claremont Institute. Mm-hmm. So the establishment, the relationship is long and deep. Some of my colleagues are Scott Yenner. Some of your colleagues are Michael Anton and David Azarad. Mm-hmm. Friends are David Goldman, Matt Peterson, Theo Wald, Jeremy Carl, and a handful of other friends who are not associated directly with us, like Eric Kaufman and Roger Kimball.
I don't want to ask you about things other people wrote in the book, but I do want to ask you about things you wrote in the book. You wrote an introduction and also a piece we'll get to in just a couple of minutes. In the introduction, though, you tell us, well, you told us previously, we've lost. The right has lost. You say in the introduction, much of the decay originated in three places: the right's own ideas, the failure to grasp the nature of the left, and the failure to arrest the left's growth. If you can briefly take on all three prongs of that argument, how did the decay happen in those three areas?
Sure. I would characterize, first of all, our situation as we have been conquered but not defeated. We're not a defeated people yet, but our institutions and large parts of the moral authority, financial power, institutional power have been conquered by the left. And I do believe that a lot of this stems from the right's own ideas. I'll give you just one example of that. For about a generation and even more, the right's view has been that the economy, its health, determines whether the country is healthy. And in a way, that's true. In a way, it's obvious that we're a liberal democracy, a commercial republic, and we do depend on the generation of prosperity and wealth for all. At the same time, once you begin to define the country that way, you turn a blind eye to all of the other ills that come along with that, or the direct conflicts that emerge from that view. I'll give you just one example. Mass, limitless consumption does not lead to healthy citizens. It leads to all sorts of private vices that destroy the kind of internal fortitude that's necessary for self-government, the glutting of appetites, the spending your life chasing, small acquisitions. You can be engrossed in that and turn away from politics and self-rule. That's one item. Another obvious item is immigration. There's an enormous conflict between this view that the economy is the only measure of our success as a nation. It must grow. It must fill jobs. And the way to do that is to import immigrants from all over the world that may not lead to peaceful, normal, civil, trustworthy situations in the country. So we narrowed our focus to only defining the country in terms of its economy, and a lot of big problems emerged from that we just right now, or at least for the past, say, generation, didn't have the tools to think through.
Arthur, you point out that it's not the first time there's been a coordinated effort to shift the agenda of the Republican Party. National Review in 1955, the Goldwater Revolution, the Reagan Revolution in 1980. We had one 15 years ago, a little less than that, in the Tea Party, but the Tea Party was very focused on economic issues and debt and deficit. Would you at all describe the effort in Up From Conservatism as being the Tea Party, but more focused on cultural issues? Is that an appropriate comparison to make?
Well, it's a very interesting point. Yes and no. I don't think that what we're calling the new right could have emerged without the Tea Party. The Tea Party was the first time in a very long time where the right organized itself physically, in the streets, parades, marches. But its view was that a handful of constitutional rebalancing items could really solve things. So one of the major policy issues that it wanted was a balanced budget amendment. And my view is that, and I think the view of many of the authors in this book, though I hesitate to speak for them, is that a balanced budget amendment, in retrospect, wouldn't have solved very many at all of the ills that the country now faces, like this enormous disbalance of power between right and left. So without the Tea Party, I think without exercising those muscles, without developing those habits of getting out of the clutches of the old right, the new right couldn't have emerged. But they are different because the new right, I think, emerges from this feeling of the growing tyranny of the left, its growing recklessness, its growing persecution of the right, its growing hatred of the right, its growing toolkit of powers used against the right. So they are similar in that it's a kind of, in a way, spontaneous bubbling up, but their focus is different. And I think the new right is much more concerned and much more aggressive than was the Tea Party. And its goals are somewhat different.
Talking with Arthur Milikh about Up From Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay. He's the editor of the brand new book. You write that the new right needs to consider the left as an enemy and not merely as an opposing movement. Strong word. So what's the difference in how you would treat those two different factions, an enemy versus an opposing movement?
Well, yes, I think that is an accurate summary of the situation. And I think that the right has been cornered into viewing the situation that way. And since we are there, it should view the situation that way. The left relentlessly uses basically eliminationist rhetoric. It uses state powers against the right in an unchecked way. It relentlessly wants to humiliate and weaken the right as seemingly the only goals for its existence, while making the claim that so long as the fascist, as they like to say, fascist right exists, which is, by the way, anything that they stands in their way, they will pursue any methods possible. And so if the right is in that situation, well, what should it do? Should it just pretend like, oh, this is normal America, and we should just either A, pray for mercy, or B, try to negotiate with people that speak up ourselves this way, or have an honest assessment of the situation that we are treated like hated enemies, and therefore we should act as if we're treated as hated enemies?
One more question from the introduction that I want to talk about your essay on education. There is an argument that conservatives can and should simply remove themselves from some portions of culture, be that schools via school choice or homeschooling or other areas of society. But you write very explicitly, hiding in the woods is not a viable political strategy. Why not?
Yes, and this is written primarily in the context of education and homeschooling. And I'll put the matter this way. I think it is extremely admirable and very difficult to do to remove your children from, the broader culture because you believe that it harms them. To take on the duties that schools should and once did fulfill on yourself. I find it admirable and it's a wonderful thing. However, I just urge our side that there are basically two paths for us. One is remove ourselves and effectively hope that they will not ban homeschooling next or whatever other thing. Or what I'm advocating for is to reconquer, is to take back schools, take back communities, and I think that is done by taking back states, by modeling ourselves on, effectively what is happening now in Florida. Strong government whose view is this state should belong to the citizens of Florida, and we're going to remake it for them in their image. And that means patriotic education. That means universities that actually develop citizens who are attached to the country, who want to serve it, who want to know its history, who have some kind of respect and admiration for it. And these are two different paths. Should we retrench, or should we have the spirit of reconquest? And I am very much for the spirit of reconquest.
We'll continue our conversation with Arthur Milikh about the new book, Up From Conservatism, right after this.
Available now, renowned psychologist Jordan Peterson joins Hillsdale College president Larry Arnn on the latest episode of The Larry Arnn Show.
Predict the future for me a little bit. It seems to me things are coming to a point. Do you think so?
Yeah, well, I think things have always been coming to a point, but they're coming to a point way faster. Well, we have Moore's Law, right? Computing power doubles every 18 months. It's like, no, you don't understand. Computing power doubles every 18 months. We're now at the point in the course of technological progress where those doublings are happening multiple times within the span of a single life. And that means the ancient archetypal battles are accelerating.
Listen to this exclusive interview with Jordan Peterson right now. Only available on The Larry Arnn Show. Find it on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. And subscribe to receive new episodes delivered right to your device. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu.
back with Arthur Milikh on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. We talk with him about the new book he's edited, Up from Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay. The chapter you co-write is on education, how to destroy and reconquer. You say early in this essay, regarding those exit strategies, homeschooling, educational choice, ESA accounts, that they're woefully inadequate. Choice does not guarantee diversity because education is inherently political. And we even see that in some of the charters that have been started in which teachers' unions get footholds inside these charters once again. The inherently political situation inside of education, how does that thwart some of these strategies?
Yes. Look, I think that the broad question that your listeners and the right broadly should be asking themselves is, in the last generation or two, what have we really won on? What is an indisputable victory that the right has had? I can't really think of an indisputable victory, but the left has had many, many victories. And it is just a rule of thumb in America that every institution that begins on the right will end on the left. There are precious few exceptions to that. And I really mean this. Hillsdale College is one of those few exceptions. But if you look around, everything else is not that way. Things have to be, the gates, the borders have to be guarded vehemently on our side, because that is the tendency. And so you see this in some of these charter schools. You know, we on the right have advocated for school choice for a very long time. In a way, it has worked by getting kids out of who are trapped in bad public schools into good charter schools. But we cannot think, as we always do, that this is going to be a silver bullet, because some of the major charter school providers are now openly declaring that they are on the left. And so we're in this relentless cat and mouse game. We try to build something up, then slowly they take it away from us, and then we try to do some kind of new building up. But the way to fortify ourselves is, as I'm saying, in the states, state mandates, strong state control, and I think that the right has this tendency to think that there will always be an escape hatch for them, and regrettably, that just proves over and over again to not really be the case.
You have spoken now a couple of times about increasing state control or state influence on schools. Two of your recommendations inside this essay, one is eliminate state teacher certification standards. One is that state legislators should mandate their own curriculum for K-12. How do those recommendations help and push forward this effort?
Yes. Well, look, I think that education should be in control of states. It has been historically in America for a very long time. And there should be set curricula that are created with a view to making good citizens. Citizens that understand the nature of our rights teaching, citizens that understand the nature of our history, citizens that are attached to our country. That is what is meant by a quote that you read earlier, by education is inherently political. Political means making citizens. Every single nation in the past has understood this, that there is no such thing as just neutrality. There is no such thing as just reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's clearly not sufficient for the formation of character. And the left also understands this very well, and this is what we oppose when the left does it. But we oppose it in the wrong way. We oppose it because we like to still think on the right that education should merely be neutral without, ideology, without some kind of ideological view of history. But the truth is we should simply admit that education must be political. We're forming citizens. We're not just forming neutral beings. And so that education should be done, modeled by the states to support the nation and the kinds of citizens that we should become.
On the subject of forming beings, there are a couple of recommendations you have on how to add to current educational standards. One is to revive physical fitness and some of the activities that went with physical fitness in, say, the 50s and 60s. The other is to increase the level of competitiveness inside schools. You say, we crown state champions in football and basketball. Why not state champions in mathematics and physics and English? Has anyone tried these sorts of things yet here in the U.S.?
Yeah, we had all of that just not long ago. I mean, in our parents' generations, that physical fitness was viewed as something that, look, just the common sense view that, fit people, strong people have the greater potential to have strong characters. I mean, it's the oldest lesson in the book that comes from the ancients. And I absolutely believe that public schools should be offering more physical fitness that is not frivolous, but the kind of physical fitness that comes with shooting, camping, some knowledge of agriculture, and competitiveness that comes from that too. But in addition, if you want to form high intellect people, they have to be bred from a very young age to see what rigorous mathematical tests, physics competitions are like, to be praised, to be elevated, to compete in the state level, to compete on the national level, to compete on the international level. You absolutely have to have these kinds of training grounds. And the most painful thing for us today in such things, in recreating these kinds of programs that we used to have, is that other people start to feel bad about themselves because, they don't qualify as champions. And it's that tearing down force that is the most hostile to the development of these kinds of young talents.
Final question for Arthur Milikh, the book Up From Conservatism. He is the editor of a series of essays inside the book. For higher education, on the subject of universities, you recommend breaking up state universities, and then maybe one focuses on business and one on science, one on agriculture. How does the breakup of state universities get us closer to your goal of destroying and then reconquering education?
And rebuilding, very importantly. Well, I would put it this way. You take a big state school and you look at that, they're almost all the same, that they have more or less healthy sciences and engineering departments and very unhealthy social sciences and humanities. And so what I would like to do, just as one example, although I'm open to other creative thinking on this, is I think that the state should say, well, look, the sciences are producing productive, intelligent students. The sciences have real publications and accomplishments. We're going to fund the sciences at 2 times the level that we currently do, because we want that to grow. And the less healthy, the more ideological, the more hostile to the country parts of the universities, namely the social sciences and the humanities, we're just going to fund them at, 25% of what we fund them right now. And since they make such boastful claims about their importance, well, students should certainly understand that. And if students continue to enroll, and if students continue to bring their federally subsidized student loans to that, then that's fine. But you guys are more or less on your own now. So breaking up universities in that way would be able to elevate the healthy parts and lower the less healthy parts, and allow a kind of sorting to take place.
Mm-hmm. The book is Up From Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay. It's edited by our guest, Arthur Milikh, who also writes the introduction and co-writes one of the essays inside. Arthur, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Matthew Mehan from Hillsdale in D.C. and Arthur Milikh, editor of the new book Up From Conservatism. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.